It's a Sunday evening in August 1971, and inside a secluded lodge at Camp David, 15 men sit around a wooden table that will soon bear the weight of a decision that reshapes human civilization. The air conditioning hums against the Maryland heat. Richard Nixon, sleeves rolled, face heavy with the knowledge of what he's about to unleash, looks at each advisor in turn. There are no cameras here, no reporters, no witnesses beyond this room. In less than 24 hours, he will appear on national television and speak 9 words that will obliterate the financial architecture of the modern world. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold. What happens in that moment is not just the end of a policy. It's the severing of money from reality itself. It's the point where currency stops being a claim on something tangible and becomes, instead, a collective dream enforced by military power and sustained by faith alone. And in the 50-plus years since that Sunday night, every financial crisis, every debt spiral, every asset bubble, every scream of inequality can trace its ancestry back to this room, this choice, this unraveling. The question that haunts us now, the one that echoes through every market crash and bailout since, is deceptively simple. What happens when nothing backs your money except the promise that someone, somewhere, will accept it tomorrow? When the dollars in your pocket are no longer receipts for gold sitting in a vault, but instead are conjured into existence by central banks with a keystroke, what stops the conjuring? What disciplines the system? What prevents those in power from simply creating money to solve every problem, to fund every war, to rescue every billionaire, until the whole edifice collapses under the weight of its own unreality? Nixon didn't think he was creating a crisis that night. He thought he was solving one. But what if solving that crisis required creating a mechanism that would generate infinite crises forever after, each one larger, each one requiring more intervention, more money creation, more suspension of economic law, until we arrive here in our present moment, where central banks hold tens of trillions in assets, where governments drown in unpayable debt, where the wealth gap yawns wider than at any point in recorded history, and where the very idea of sound money seems like a quaint relic of a forgotten age? To understand how we arrived at that Camp David table, you have to rewind to the ashes of the Second World War, to 1944, when the world's economic powers gathered at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to build a new financial order from the rubble of global conflict. The old order, the gold standard, had collapsed in the chaos of the Great Depression and the war that followed. Nations had gone off gold to print money for war machines, and the trust that once held the system together had shattered. So at Bretton Woods, they built something new, a compromise, a halfway house between the discipline of gold and the flexibility of fiat currency. The U.S. dollar would be backed by gold at $35 per ounce, and every other currency would peg itself to the dollar. If you held dollars, you held a claim on American gold. The system worked because America held most of the world's gold reserves after the war, because American industry was unmatched, and because everyone agreed to the rules. It was elegant. It was stable. It created the economic boom of the 1950s and 1960s. But it had a fatal flaw built into its foundation. It required the United States to behave responsibly, to live within its means, to resist the temptation to print more dollars than it had gold to back them. And that restraint, that discipline, was about to shatter against the rocks of political ambition and imperial overreach. By the mid-1960s, the cracks were already showing. Lyndon Johnson wanted both guns and butter, a great society at home and a war in Vietnam abroad, and he wanted to pay for both without raising taxes or making hard choices. So the government spent, the Federal Reserve printed, and slowly, inevitably, the number of dollars circulating in the world began to exceed the amount of gold sitting in Fort Knox and the vaults of the New York Federal Reserve. Other nations noticed. France, under Charles de Gaulle, began converting its dollar reserves back into gold, sending warships to New York Harbor to collect the bullion, a pointed reminder that the American promise was still, technically, enforceable. By 1971, the United States held just over 8,000 tons of gold, but foreigners held claims on more than 3 times that amount. The arithmetic was brutal and undeniable. If even a fraction of dollar holders demanded their gold, the system would collapse. The gold window had become a trap. Leave it open and watch the gold drain away until nothing remained. Close it and break the foundational promise of the post-war order. Nixon, paranoid and calculating, facing re-election and an economy sliding toward recession, chose to break the promise. The weekend at Camp David was a study in secrecy and control panic. Nixon gathered his economic advisors, Treasury Secretary John Connally, Federal Reserve Chair Arthur Burns, Budget Director George Shultz, and others, under the pretense of a routine meeting. No formal agenda was announced. Even most of the president's staff didn't know what was about to unfold. Connally, a Texas Democrat with the swagger of a man who believed in American power above all else, pushed hardest for the decisive break. Burns, the academic economist who understood the old rules, hesitated, warned of chaos, but ultimately yielded. They debated through Saturday. They ran scenarios. They gamed out international reactions, market responses, political fallout. And by Sunday afternoon, the decision was made. The gold window would close immediately and without warning. Wage and price controls would be imposed to contain the inflationary pressure everyone knew was coming. A 10% surcharge on imports would pressure other nations to revalue their currencies. It was shock therapy for the global economy, and it would be delivered without anesthetic. That Sunday night, Nixon appeared on television in prime time, interrupting the most popular show of the era to announce the new economic policy. His voice carried the weight of historical consequence, but also the salesmanship of a politician. He framed it as protecting American workers, defending prosperity, striking back at international speculators who were supposedly attacking the dollar. He never used the word default, though that's what it was, a unilateral decision to break a promise made to every holder of American currency. The reaction was immediate and global. Markets around the world shut down in confusion. Finance ministers scrambled to understand what the rules were now. Gold prices began to float upward, no longer tethered to $35. And in the months that followed, currencies floated against each other, fluctuating wildly as the world adjusted to a new reality. Money was now worth whatever people believed it was worth, backed by nothing more than the economic strength and military power of the nation that issued it. The era of fiat currency had begun, not through careful planning or international consensus, but through unilateral American fiat, imposed on the world because the alternative was watching American power drain away one gold bar at a time. If stories like this fascinate you, consider leaving a like. It helps bring more hidden chapters of economic history to light. Because what happened next is where the real cost of 1971 starts to compound, where the decision made in that room begins to metastasize into crisis after crisis, each one a symptom of the same underlying condition, an economic system unmoored from any external constraint, floating on faith and force. The immediate aftermath of Nixon's decision was chaos dressed up as liberation. For a brief moment, there was euphoria. American exports became more competitive as the dollar fell. Stock markets, after initial panic, rallied. Nixon won re-election in a landslide in 1972. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had broken. Without the discipline of gold convertibility, governments discovered they could finance deficits by simply creating money. Central banks could lower interest rates without worrying about gold outflows. The guardrails were gone, and by the mid-1970s, the consequences arrived with a vengeance. Inflation exploded, reaching double digits in the United States and even higher in other nations. The dollar, once as good as gold, lost 30% of its purchasing power in just a few years. Oil-producing nations, realizing their oil was being paid for in currency that was rapidly depreciating, quadrupled prices, triggering the oil shocks that defined the decade. The economy entered stagflation, a nightmare scenario that wasn't supposed to be possible under Keynesian economics. High inflation and high unemployment at the same time, economic stagnation combined with currency debasement. Paul Volcker, who took over the Federal Reserve in 1979, had to jack interest rates above 20% to break the back of inflation. inducing the worst recession since the Great Depression. The medicine worked, but it was brutal, and it revealed a new pattern that would repeat over and over in the decades to come. In a fiat currency system, every problem gets solved by creating more money, and every solution creates the next crisis. But the deeper transformation, the one that would reshape capitalism itself, was just beginning. In the old system, under gold, there were limits. Banks couldn't lend beyond their reserves. Governments couldn't deficit spend without consequence. Debt had to be repaid or defaulted on. There was no third option. After 1971, those limits dissolved. If you needed money, the central bank could create it. If you had debt, inflation could erode its real value. If an institution was too big to fail, you could bail it out with freshly printed currency. And so began the greatest debt accumulation in human history. U.S. government debt, which had been declining as a percentage of GDP through the 1960s, began to climb. Corporate debt exploded as companies discovered they could borrow cheaply to buy back stock and engineer financial returns instead of building real productive capacity. Household debt soared as credit cards, mortgages, and student loans became the tools of everyday life. And most important, financial debt, the debt that banks owe to each other and to the system, grew exponentially, creating a web of interconnected obligations so complex that no one fully understood it anymore. By 2008, total debt in the U.S. economy was nearly 4 times GDP. The system had become a leveraged bet on perpetual growth, on the assumption that asset prices would always rise, that central banks would always step in, that the money creation could continue forever without consequence. The 2008 financial crisis was the inevitable result of this logic taken to its extreme. Banks had learned they could take massive risks because, in a fiat system, they would be rescued. Mortgage-backed securities, derivatives, synthetic CDOs. The entire architecture of modern finance was built on the assumption that housing prices couldn't fall nationally, that risk could be sliced and spread and priced so precisely that it disappeared. But it didn't disappear. It metastasized. And when the housing bubble burst, when Lehman Brothers collapsed and the financial system seized up, the response was not to let the system reset, not to allow bad debts to be purged and malinvestment to be liquidated. The response was to create money on a scale that would have been unthinkable in any prior era. Trillions of dollars in bailouts, quantitative easing, zero interest rates, central banks buying up government bonds and mortgage securities and corporate debt. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet, which had been under $1 trillion for most of its history, exploded to over $4 trillion, then $7 trillion, then $9 trillion during COVID. The European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England, all followed the same script. Create money, suppress interest rates, inflate asset prices, rescue the system. And in doing so, they created a world where wealth flows not to those who produce, but to those who own assets, who have access to cheap credit, who can borrow against inflating portfolios to buy more assets in a self-reinforcing loop that leaves everyone else behind. This is where the crisis of inequality emerges, not as a separate phenomenon, but as the direct and predictable consequence of the monetary regime born in 1971. When money can be created freely, those closest to the money spigot benefit most. Banks get loans at near-zero rates. Corporations borrow billions to buy back stock. The wealthy leverage their assets to acquire more assets. Meanwhile, workers' wages, which still have to be earned through labor, stagnate in real terms even as the cost of housing, education, and health care, all inflated by cheap credit, soars beyond reach. The middle class, which thrived in the Bretton Woods era when money was sound and wages bought real purchasing power, has been hollowed out. Entire generations now enter adulthood with debt burdens their parents never imagined, priced out of homeownership, unable to save because every dollar saved is being silently confiscated by inflation, by the debasement of currency that is the necessary byproduct of a system that solves every crisis by creating more money. The statistics are stark and undeniable. The top 1% has captured more wealth gains since 1971 than the bottom 50% combined. The gap between asset owners and wage earners has become a chasm. And yet, the system perpetuates itself because the alternative, allowing assets to deflate and debt to default, would destroy the portfolios of the powerful and the pension funds of the middle class in one catastrophic unraveling. And so we arrive at the present moment, where the contradictions have become impossible to ignore. Government debt in advanced economies exceeds 100% of GDP. Central bank balance sheets have swollen beyond anything imaginable a generation ago. Inflation, the ghost that was supposed to have been tamed, has returned with a fury, eroding purchasing power while central banks face an impossible choice: raise rates and crash the economy, or keep them low and watch currency debase further. Housing has become unaffordable in every major city. Healthcare costs spiral. Education requires decades of debt. Retirement is increasingly a fantasy for those who don't own assets. And through it all, the money printer hums, because stopping it would mean confronting the reality that the system is built on a foundation of unpayable debt and unfulfillable promises. Every crisis now follows the same pattern. Some sector over-leverages, some bubble pops, panic spreads, and the central bank steps in with newly created money to prevent collapse. The dot-com bubble, the housing bubble, the corporate debt bubble, the everything bubble of the COVID era. Each one larger than the last. Each one requiring more intervention. Each one pushing the day of reckoning further into the future, while making that reckoning more catastrophic when it finally arrives. There's a bitter irony in all of this. Nixon closed the gold window because he wanted to preserve American economic power, to avoid the pain of austerity, to keep the empire running. And in the short term, it worked. The dollar remained the world's reserve currency, not because it was backed by gold, but because it was backed by the full might of American military and economic dominance, by the petrodollar system that required oil to be priced in dollars, by the network effects of global trade that made the dollar indispensable even as its value eroded. But in preserving power through monetary sleight of hand, America and the world entered a trap. The ability to create money freely became both a superpower and an addiction. It enabled unprecedented military spending, global intervention, and the financialization of the economy. But it also created a system where real productive investment declined, where manufacturing hollowed out, where short-term financial engineering replaced long-term value creation, and where political leaders lost the ability to make hard choices because they could always paper over problems with debt and money creation. The discipline that gold imposed, imperfect and often brutal as it was, served a function. It forced nations to live within their means, to prioritize, to invest in real productivity rather than financial abstractions. Without that discipline, the system drifted toward entropy, toward a world where money is abundant, but purchasing power erodes, where billionaires multiply, but the middle class withers, where the stock market hits record highs while homelessness spreads in the shadow of empty investment properties. Some economists will tell you that the end of Bretton Woods was necessary and beneficial, that the rigidity of the gold standard would have strangled growth, that flexible exchange rates and monetary policy discretion have prevented another Great Depression. They're not entirely wrong. The ability to create money allowed central banks to respond to the 2008 crisis in ways that may have prevented complete economic collapse. The flexibility of fiat currency has enabled developing nations to manage their economies without being held hostage to gold flows. But what's undeniable is that 1971 marked the beginning of an era where the financial economy decoupled from the real economy, where debt grew faster than productivity, where wealth inequality exploded, where each crisis became larger and required more extreme intervention, and where the future was increasingly mortgaged to sustain the present. The gold standard had its own pathologies, its own brutalities, particularly for debtors and the working class during deflationary spirals. But the fiat system that replaced it has its own brutalities, and they fall heaviest on those who cannot access cheap credit, who live on wages rather than assets, who watch their purchasing power erode while being told the economy is booming because stock prices are rising. What's haunting about this history is not that Nixon made the wrong choice in 1971. Perhaps there was no right choice available by then. only a choice between different kinds of crisis. What's haunting is that we have built 50 years of economic structures, expectations, institutions, and inequalities on the foundation of that decision, and now we are trapped within the logic it created. Entire generations have grown up in a world where money is just numbers on screens, where central banks conjure trillions with a keystroke, where the idea that currency should be anchored to something real seems absurd and archaic. The collective faith that sustains fiat currency remains strong, but faith is fragile, especially when the gaps between rich and poor widen, when inflation devours savings, when each new crisis reveals the system's fundamental instability. And if that faith ever breaks, if the world decides that dollars and euros and yen are just paper backed by nothing, then the transition to whatever comes next will make 1971 look like a gentle policy adjustment. The cryptocurrencies, the return to gold standard rhetoric, the rise of alternative monetary systems. These are symptoms of a world that senses something is fundamentally broken, even if it can't quite articulate what or how to fix it. The legacy of 1971 is that we live in an economic hall of mirrors where nothing is quite real, where value is whatever we collectively agree it is until suddenly we don't agree anymore, where crisis and bailout have become the rhythm of economic life, and where the distance between the wealth of asset owners and the poverty of wage earners grows with every turn of the money printer. We have built a civilization on debt, on the assumption that tomorrow's growth will pay for today's spending, that asset prices will always rise, that central banks will always have our backs. And maybe they will. Maybe this time really is different. Maybe modern monetary theory and financial engineering have solved the ancient problems of scarcity and trade-offs. Or maybe we're just in the longest, slowest unraveling of a monetary system ever attempted. And every crisis since 1971 is just another tremor before the earthquake that finally forces us to confront what happens when money is backed by nothing but faith, force, and an ever-growing mountain of debt. Nixon thought he was solving a crisis that Sunday night at Camp David. He didn't realize he was beginning one that would never end, that would shape every economic reality of our lives, that would turn money itself into a political weapon and a source of endless instability. What would you have done if you were in that room at Camp David, knowing what was at stake, but also knowing the impossible position America had created for itself? Would you have kept the gold window open and watched American power drain away? Would you have imposed austerity and sacrificed political survival? Or would you have done exactly what Nixon did? Break the promise, unleash the consequences, and let future generations deal with the fallout? Tell me in the comments. And if you crave more stories that reveal the hidden architecture of power, money, and the choices that shape our world, subscribe, because what we've covered today is just one thread in a tapestry of decisions that brought us to this moment. And the next story might just change how you see the system we live within forever.